Red light. Bingo. We are on the air, and let us click the stuff here. Oh, there's the magic light bulb and the clickety clacks and all the things that we don't have sound for. Welcome to Evolution Hour. We're continuing the saga of stuff and things, to borrow Strike's phrase. And there's my little logo. There's tortucanwordpress.com. If you don't have this on your website, if you're not looking at it, then yeah, do it. I've got stuff up on there. So now we will stop sharing. I can close that off and get to the show itself. Thanks for Jackson Wheat to show up today. His class was canceled, so he's able to assist in our discussion and keep track if anybody shows up in the live chat, which there isn't anybody yet. For those of you who have been sleeping in a cave for the last couple months, I've been doing an extended analysis of this creationist book, Contested Bones, which was sent to me for analysis. Because they didn't want to go through the rigmarole, and it was right up my alley, and I couldn't afford to buy it, but they were happy to get it for me. And it's basically the current creationist position on human evolution, which is ain't any. And when you look at their sources, which required constructing a bibliography and analyzing them because they didn't have an index, they didn't have a bibliography. This is piss poor method for any work, and particularly annoying for one that purports to be scientific. A pattern comes up. Brian Stevens is in the room. Hello, Brian. That the method that Rupi and Sanford have done from the get-go is rely on Rupi first, who basically is the point man on here. And I think he's a chemist by background. He hasn't had any paper trail anywhere on the internet that I could see. So this is like his first effort. And judging by this, he should stop. And because he's a very bad superficial scholar. He trawls around through the literature, mainly for authority quotes. 40% of all the sources that he cited are just authority quoting. And when he does cite technical literature, and it's not bad for the field that he's getting into, he's bumped into an awful lot of the technical literature. The problem is he misrepresents a lot of it. So about 40% of the technical literature that they've cited, they are deliberately or coincidentally failing to notice the content that conflicts with their argument. So we just ended the old Australopithecine sections, and now we're into Homo habilis, handyman, which anybody who knows about them knows that they're very fragmentary fossils. We don't have full skeletons of Homo habilis, so it's still contested as to whether it's one or two species or whether it's actually a variant of Australopithecines or what. And so that's understandable. But the reason why that zone of time about 2 million years ago is so relevant is because the first very primitive tools start showing up in the same region where these Homo habilis and other ones are showing up. So somebody or something is going chip, 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 boom, 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 and it's the early stages of tool use. So that's why Homo habilis, handyman, as it is in that fancy Latin stuff, is brought onto the field. Now, the scientists have been busy trying to figure out what the data are. And one of the issues is the human hand adapted for tool use, or was it adapted for other things and it ended up being really good for making tools? And that was the point that some of the sources that our creationists were citing, that's what their topic was. And instead, they focus in on the fact that the one hand that is attributed or not to Homo habilis, and it might be one of the Australopithecines, has a little bit, tiny bit more ape-like features. And that it is argued in this Almetia paper, one that Rupi cited from 2009, which I put a link up to in the description, and one from 2010 that Rupi managed not to cite, which went into yet more detail, is that the human hand did not develop intrinsically for tool use. It did a lot of stuff for grabbing things for fruit and so forth, and had a broad range. So the shape that we find in our hand is not uniquely suited for tool making, but ended up being really useful for it. That's their point. And all of that gets left out of Rupi and Sanford's summary. All they're looking at is, gee, this hand is a little bit more ape-like. When you look at the bones, there are only minor variations, and you can easily imagine the kind of microevolutionary gene mutations that were involved to produce a tiny little different bump on a particular bone and a tiny little different shape on that little thing up there. That's the difference between us and gorillas. What's so surprising about the physical anatomy of all the primates is how relatively standardized it is. And it's only minor tweakings here and there and here and there in one lineage or another that produce all the variety that we see. And because the creationists want to see everything as just ape and humans as a dividing line, they're parsing stuff and missing all of the interesting stuff. So putting up the links to these technical papers, dive into them and read, because they're really wonderful. The 2009 one is a little bit more general, so it's even easier to access. And then for those who want the little more technical material that they did in the 2010 one, proceed accordingly. It's really interesting shit. I think it's absolutely delightful. So what I'm looking at too, and I've done a quick glance through the chapter, is the one thing they don't discuss in the Homo habilis chapter, apparently, is the tools. So it's just whoop, off the scope, and then we don't have to think about that at all. Keep an eye, Jackson, on what's going on in the live chat too. See if we get any questions on there, or whatever, like saying, "Hey, move on," or whatever the subject matter is. But now Homo habilis is so interesting, first because it's very fragmentary, so you have to have very technical methods of figuring out what means what. There was a paper by Bernard Wood that Rupi cited. It's an older one from 1998, so 20 years ago. That's like antediluvian in science terms, but it's still a useful thing because it's telling you the directions that the science is going to go. We're in 2018 now, so the kinds of analytical tools that they were doing to model parts back in 1998 is that, which was being the early era of Jurassic Park movies, you know, where they're starting to figure out how to use computer technology. Now they can do graphic modeling on a scale that's just spectacular, and therefore they can figure a bit more about stuff, about working out that the human hand did not evolve expressly for tool use, and all of that's nicely settled. So what we're going to be dealing with is to see to what extent they're trying to play cherry picky as to how do you tell the difference between a Homo habilis that doesn't make tools or could make tools versus an Australopithecine that didn't make tools or could make tools based upon the physical anatomy. It's ironic that the very animal that was being regarded as the possible one that the hand belonged to, which they kept on referring to as Paranthropus, but it's actually one of the Australopithecines. It depends on how you want to classify it. That one of the more advanced Australopithecines may have been our tool maker. And I think there's other work. I didn't put some linkage on it. And I'll see what...
Isn't the Oldowan industry associated with Australopiths?
Yeah. That's whether or not Homo habilis is technically speaking the very first of our genus or just the most advanced of the Australopithecines. Does it really matter? You got an ape going around chipping tools in a way that's more sophisticated than anything that had happened before. And we can see the gradation even amongst the living primates, which are not habitual tool users in the way that these Australopithecines were. Now, what kind of little brainy things are going on to generate that sort of stuff is paleogenomics. We don't have Australopithecines to run under the CAT scanner to figure out what happens when they're making tools. We can't do that for Homo erectus. We can't do that for Neanderthals. But we can eventually, maybe not within my lifetime, but the way the gene evolution work is going, maybe within my lifetime, they're going to be able to retro-engineer which genes are and which mutations and regulatory cascades are happening in the brain that relate to the precision tool handling and conceptualization skills. We know, and this is another area that I'll be intrigued to see if Rupi and Sanford ever bump into, and I'm not holding my breath, is that whole issue about what it means to make a tool inside your head. I devoted quite a long section, and if you haven't read this, read this. It's still, I'm very proud of it. It's good work. The Planet of the Apes chapter in the old tip in my website. And I put the damn website up on there, and you should have it linked to. It's quite an extensive book-length thing on human evolution and how creationists have missed the dots. And one of the things that points out that I found so impressive when I was doing it originally, and it hasn't gotten any less data since, is that in order to make these more increasingly sophisticated tools, when people try to replicate them today, and there's a small band of really fabulous paleo researchers who physically replicate making of tools in the way that the humans would have done it, or hominids. And you really quickly discover you got to think through this before you start chipping. You just don't go clunk and see if something useful hits off. Eventually, you're reaching the stage when you're taking the rock and you're going, oh, that one doesn't look good. Ooh, now that one might work. Now inside of there, I could do that. And if I hit here, that'll chip that part off there, and that'll be just the trick. Let me try that one. Boom. You have to anticipate and visualize in functionally the same way that Michelangelo was visualizing David inside of a block of marble. And you can see where you need to attack for the chiseling because you're so good at it. You've done it so much that you can conceptualize this model. This is where this connects up then with language, because it also becomes an interesting question. How can you pass on this skill to your kid unless you can talk to them about it and explain why you're doing what you do? So my suspicion is that language is developing very early in conjunction with this tool usage that we can't test out because we can't get the time machine and go back and take a look at an Australopithecine making tools and doing whatever it is. But I would find it more amazing to think that language is a late adjunct than it is a really early one. So anyway, download that damn Planet of the Apes chapters. Download everything that I put up. As I've said before, they're in PDF format, which is a pain in the ass if you're on an iPhone. My apologies. But in that case, make a point. It's better to see it on a PC or I guess tablets, if they can have multiple things on tablets at the same time, that you want to make a copy of the main text so you can open up it and keep one to the notes and one to the main text. So because you can't flip back and forth, I don't think, in most PDF readers. So if you see a footnote, you have to manually scroll down, which is a pain in the ass. So if you have one file open to the notes, there's tons of notes in there that'll give the background references. And then technically you'd need a third file for the damn references to be able to open those up. So pardon me for writing in old style bookese back in the days when that was bookese. And that's the way I did these things. Have to work beyond it. Nowadays, where you have bigger file assemblies and all that, literally, when I was writing those chapters, I had to keep the files smaller than 1.4 megs because that was the size of a floppy disk file size that you could save the chapter on. I literally could not save the entire book on a single floppy. So that's the weirdness of how technology is amassed just since I wrote that chapter back in the early 2000s. There's a lot of new technology work and new technical papers since then. They found more taxa, but the basic outlines of what I did in Planet of the Apes is still true. The mistakes people are doing on evading the paleontology and not connecting dots and not thinking about stuff is still pretty much the same problems today as was the case when I wrote the chapter. And I went into an awful lot of the intelligent design evasions on this, Philip Johnson and others in that, some of the issues on racism, because Louis Agassiz, who was an anti-evolutionist, was a polygenist. He was convinced that the human races had separate origins, and he was just a flaming racist. So I bring up a lot of different subject matters along the way in Planet of the Apes, and that's why it got to be so big. That's one of the reasons why I never ended up doing it as a standalone book, the TIP project, because it was too big. By the time I got down, I'd originally planned to put all the human evolution stuff in the paleontology one, Bones chapter. And it was just going to be an add-on. So I was going to be talking about the Cambrian explosion and the bird evolution and reptile-mammal transition and human evolution all in one chapter. But as it got bigger and bigger and more detailed, I realized, oh, that ain't going to work. So I then shunted that over to chapter 5, which was the chapter after intelligent design. And by the time I actually got to writing the thing, it had expanded to the point where it's functionally a book all on its own. And bear that in mind when reading it. But I'm quite pleased with the thing. There was a paleoanthropologist up at the University of Toronto, I've forgotten her name now, who did the actual technical vetting on it. And she spotted one goof I had made on Australopithecine tooth growth patterns that was wrong, that I had multiple sources for, but they were all secondary ones. And I hadn't been up on the technical literature. In my defense, the technical literature wasn't easily available in the early 21st century. So a lot of these technical papers, I had no way of finding out about. This was before Google searching. And she pulled me on it. And I call attention to it in the text. I explain what the mistake I made and why, and explain how I corrected it. Because the source method's mantra is to err is human, but to correct requires sound method. And so that's the thing that you should always make use of. Everyone will make mistakes at some point, even if you can rely on multiple sources. The point is it's much harder to justify stupid mistakes today because you would have accessibility of the primary source work. So you can read the work and whether there's been criticism of it, and then you can read more recent work and find out how that older work has stood this test of time. Are they still relying on it as a reliable work or not? You can find that out way faster today and get the full text papers to look at too. I'm at the stage where you can easily get 80% or so of the technical literature full text, free somewhere. And either on the journals themselves, Journal of Anatomy, for example, that stuff is open access for older papers. Science and Nature are still piss in the water. You have to have subscriptions for them. But huge numbers of the scientists will have posted their work online. They'll put them on ResearchGate. They'll put them on Academia EDU. College courses will post them in conjunction with their syllabuses. So you'll be able to get the PDF somewhere, freebie. And so if you're scratched for money, the way I am, you can make use of that stuff. So there ain't no excuse for ignorance today. And you can use that as a weapon if you get more into the intelligent design creationism debate online or in real-time terms. Figure out, get the primary sources, follow up the stuff. I put a link to my debate with Kent Hovind, which is pure source methods work. And I did what a lot of people thought couldn't be done, which is I tripped up Kent Hovind in a debate context. And I did it because I did full source methods. I hit him on the ground running with the fact that he doesn't know how to do source methods. He can't read sources. He copies stuff credulously. Arwin, yeah. And it completely threw him off. Well, this ain't rocket science, kids. Everybody can do that. Everybody, and Jackson, who's nodding his head, knows it's something everybody can do. And it's fun because there's not only the joy of filleting an idiot in front of somebody and doing it fairly and squarely, but also in the course of following up on the research, you'll learn so much that you didn't know before. You open up doorways of discovery. Jackson Weed and I, and that's where I'll bring him in on this. We're doing a book going after the answers books. The Creationist Answers series. And Jackson's doing most of the heavy lifting, but I'm coming in then and buffing afterwards and bringing up new material. And the neat thing about it is that I'm always learning stuff from reading his original text, and then I'm coming in and looking at new material that expands it, and he learns stuff from the new stuff that I bring in, and between the two of us, we're better than we were before. Would you not agree, Jackson?
I can agree to this.
Yeah, it's exhilarating. It's so much fun and a learning experience, and it can never be a downside because you're finding the original material, you're improving your understanding of technical issues, you're finding better ammunition to work with, so you're now a moving target. Whereas creationists are not moving targets. They're stick in the muds. They can't help repeat the same old shtick. So if you know their source base, and you know the sources they don't know, and you're way ahead of them, and you can explain their side better than they can, and you can explain why their side is wrong and why your side is right at the data level, and you know what data they have bumped into, so they can't respond to you because they haven't looked at it. What's the downside?
Yeah, that is true. That's like in the example of the Pegasophera hypothesis that I was looking at for the chapter I'm working on right now, which is on baraminology. It was just tossed out there with a very inflammatory statement and then ignored entirely. So
yeah, those are always dead giveaways. This is a general rule when you're dealing with creationists. Watch for buzzwords when they bring up specialized things. And do they really know what they mean by the specialized thing? If you don't know about it, you have to tread carefully. But if you do know, I call them litmus test issues, that when there are certain things that pop up, you're going, Uh-oh, I've already looked into that little thing. So, you know, you got the living fossils trope, you got the origins are bust, you got the Cambrian explosion, you got the issues of Lenski's experiments and micromutation and bacterial resistance. These things show up in a lot of the back and forth in the creation evolution debate. And they can be technical issues. I had to go into a lot of technical side on dealing with Michael Behe's stuff on bacterial resistance, but I learned a lot of shit in that way. And now I have a much better understanding that almost all of these bacterial resistance modalities and the ability to digest new stuff and respond to the environment involves active sites that are the wiggly parts in core molecules that act as the chomper, the thing that does stuff. And there are critical points on those that when they mutate, it can take on new functions. And so it's a relatively minor number of things that do. Some of them will have downsides initially, that a thing, for example, that slows down. If you're being attacked by a molecule that's going to kill you, that's what we want to do in the hospital. We want to kill the organism that's making a problem. So you dump a chemical at it. And the process where the bacterium brings the food into intake, it has to slow that down in order to deal with the damned attacker at times. So that can be a downside. Or the things that happen inside that eat it, that eat the unpleasant stuff that maybe is there already, it has to speed up the process. Well, that has a downside under certain circumstances. So everything in biology is a complex trade-off. And when you look at the details, you discover what those actually are. And you'll find out the creationist tends not to look at any of those details. That's what makes it so delicious. So if you read the tip 1.7 at my main website on bacterial resistance and Behe, this came up because he brought it up at the Dover trial. See how stuff has connections? And then in Evolution Slam Dunk, and I'll put the thing in the title on there. If you don't have Evolution Slam Dunk, why the hell not? It's a superb book. I'm extremely proud of it. It's on a topic no one's done before, so you'll be way ahead of the game on a bunch of stuff, and it's up to date. And plus, RJ needs the royalties. Damn it! For a work of this type, if Bill Nye or Neil deGrasse Tyson's name were on it, I have no doubt it'd be up at the bestseller list on the New York Times. But why then is it not more widely known? So everybody that doesn't have it, get it. Everybody who has it, tell people that you know about why it's important and that it's a useful book, and then also use it. Read it, put your Post-it notes in spots where particular information comes up, digest the information, digest the method approach to it, which is follow the sources, look up stuff, fact check me, find out, yeah, I'm actually accurate, and proceed accordingly. And if you're on Facebook, if you know, contact deGrasse Tyson and tell him, hey, bring Downard on your Star Talk and talk about this subject. It's important. These are all the kinds of things that you people out there can help with. I can't all do this. I'm just a schlump here in my den, trying to do work and trying to scratch and keep going. I'm a one-man band, although with Jackson, now that we're working on this thing, we're a two-person band, but it's still a low-budget operation. And there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of creationist woo out there, and the goal is to obliterate all of it and do it not by one pundit like me doing all the work, but a network of people who connect up together efficiently and exchange information rapidly. Look at what we're doing here. We can communicate video. We can have things on YouTube. We can have Twitter feeds. We can exchange stuff in live chats in a way that's blindingly fast. Darwin had to write letters to people and send them by sailing ship all the way around to places and wait weeks or months to get a reply, and then write another letter because he didn't get the information that he wanted. And no wonder science was slower in those days. So we have no excuse today in the 21st century. Oh yes, Jackson's saying he's been reading a lot about that very point, about how, can you imagine what Darwin would have done with the internet? What he would have done with email and PDFs. Oh, you could just, boom, it would be like this explosion. And the fact that what he was able to do by letters and slow motion, whereas people who are sloppy thinkers tend to not do that kind of stuff. We've got an opportunity here that, especially in this time when anti-science is so prevalent and fake news and nobody can tell, or it's just your opinion, you got your websites and I got ours. Source methods is the method for analyzing this. And it doesn't matter what it is, source methods counts. Have you grounded it in primary sources? Have you paid attention to all the available data? Or have you worked out what problems there might be with your model? Are you willing to change your mind based on new evidence? Those are exactly the same things we're seeing in the creationism case with Holocaust deniers, with people in politics on the left or right who are rigid ideologues and you just can't get past them. It's all Tortugan alert stuff. And if you ground yourself in sound method in every possible respect, you can't help but become a better thinker, a clearer thinker, a fairer thinker. To never attack somebody for something they didn't say, never attack something for a position they don't hold, but don't shy away from criticizing people for things they actually do. Puffalophagus there, the more you examine the reality, the more it resembles the fixed attribute point system of an RPG. I won't go that far. But I will say that I philosophically, here we're going to have philosophy alert. Dun, dun, dun. I believe there's only one universal reality, and all the things that are true independent of your opinion of them, and all the things that aren't true are not true independent of your opinion of them. And what you can imagine is that individuals have to kind of figure out what those are, and they'll take a stand on true, false, and whether they're decidable or undecidable or not, in my case. And you could theoretically argue that cultures or individuals that are really bad at mapping things onto their right landscape on that chart are going to get into trouble eventually. And the cultures or individuals that are better at it, not perfect, can't be perfect, but better at it in mapping true, false, decidable, undecidable accurately, will fare better in the long run, kind of, sort of, we hope. And the fact that we've had a lot of dark ages and fall apart civilization times suggests that people can lose their way on that. And then you have to figure out why they lose their way on that. And I contend it's because they got a bad case of can't figure out what's really true and what's really false, and they don't have a good method. So this methodology issue is not trivial. Civilizations are made or broken by it, and cultures thrive or atrophy by it. The moment you start throwing around the fake news tag, as certain people in politics have taken to do, and make up shit at the drop of a hat, and people literally don't care whether that's true or false, but, you know, so long as the economy is doing good, except maybe the economy isn't doing so good, and they don't notice. That's when civilizations unravel. You find people that have been very flawed, but otherwise brilliant, like Thomas Jefferson, who had slaves. Nonetheless, he was a great believer in reason and insatiably curious. Somebody else who had fascinating character flaws, Benjamin Franklin, also was one of these geek guys, super genius, probably one of the most brilliant people ever to be on the scene. Good gravy, what he would have done with the internet. Unlike Jefferson, who would have been pissed off at bank teller machines and credit cards and stuff, he would wonder, why aren't you living on farms the way you're supposed to? Urbanite Franklin would have a Facebook page, and he'd have a Twitter account, and he'd be hunting up chicks on the dating sites, and he'd be doing technical papers and science experiments and writing political things and doing blogs. I have no doubt whatsoever. Of all of the founding fathers, Ben Franklin is most obviously the most modern of them. You could just slip him into any time frame and he would pick up the speed right off the bat. He's a remarkably modernist character. So we're about to the half-hour point, and it's time for the dreaded can rattle, and remind everybody about how I can keep going at this or not. And let's do our bloody well screen share and the temporary infinite regress. There's our patrons. Stephen and Mary Gale and Keith and Dyer and Andrew and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Daniel and Ralph and Bo and Eric and Benjamin and Staggles and Alex and Cyrus, who's helping me do the audiobook of Fog. Todd Israel, Everett and Paul. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I call attention to the fact that technically speaking, I don't get really much of any of the money that they put up at patreon.com, because Patreon is slow as molasses when you're not a heavy duty cash flow person. So I remind again, if you want to help really super duper fast, there's GoFundMe.com DCGo. That stuff really gets to me. It's excellent. They take a relatively small overhead on things. The amount of money they took out for the fundraiser that Cirrus did to get my microphone and all that stuff was a big chunk, and it ended up only getting about 50% of the relative value. Way more of the money actually gets to me on GoFundMe. So there are upsides to these things. The one thing that I've been hoping for and has not yet done, it was not even suggested by me. It was suggested by a friend who said the $5 challenge. Buy RJ a cup of coffee. How many people, if you bumped into me and heard a lecture of mine or whatever, would say, I'll take you, here's a coffee and a donut. I can pump for that. Well, you could do that at GoFundMe. $5, $10. Think of the amount of money you spend on a movie. And the group that I wanted, big blocks of people, ones that have thousands of followers, they could do, even a chunk of them doing that, could all do that all at once. That would be spectacular. Hasn't happened yet. Are our brains not able to do that connectivity? Are we all herding cats? That's the puzzlement. Then the other are the steady patrons. There are a few local people who know me, and they plump down $10 every month, or sometimes more than that in a month. And I thank them. Elizabeth, I won't give your last name because she likes to be a low key. Thank you very much. But what would be neat if there were just some patrons who say, yeah, I could spare $60 in a year, $5 a month, and set up a recurring thing. I'm sounding like the pitchmeisters at public radio and public broadcasting, which when I had money available, I used to support and would love to again, frankly. So everything would come around, go around financially. But the idea, if I had a core group of supporters that way, that I could count on, that money is going to come in. And that means that if I have to like get a new lawnmower, which one of these days I've got to do, or put fuel in the tank to keep the house warm, which at the moment I can't do, $400 a pop for that kind of thing at current oil prices. I could be able to do that because I could build up a surplus beyond my Social Security and the stuff that I do and the little trickle of book royalties, which would be better if there were more book sales. More people who have Evolution Slam Dunk means more money coming in, and everybody telling everybody else about it so that there's more thing. Eventually, that there's enough buzz on this where everyone's talking about Slam Dunk. Oh, you got to have Slam Dunk. It's the book. Then theoretically, I might be able to interest somebody that will be connected to a regular publisher, and we can do that second edition illustrated version, updated, that would put it up on the college level thing, which Christine Janis said that it would do if it just had the pictures. So together we can do all this, but it requires that we work together more and link up more. And I know it's often difficult for us in the wonderful world of secular minds. We don't do leaps of faith. We don't do evangelicalism. It's the thing that we don't do. And yet this is exactly what our opponents do really well. And this means that even though they believe stupid, they have a social network that's unbelievably efficient. And so that's why there's Ken Ham and Kent Hovind and Breitbart and all of these others that can marshal tens of thousands of people and networking in a way that we have as many people, but we don't network as efficiently. So it's a skill set we got to teach ourselves. I'm an old dog trying to learn new tricks. I'm terrible at, as Pologia told me, that I suck at fundraising. And I freely admit that because it's not my nature. But nonetheless, yes, Michelle, so yes, please. Oh, I will do that. Yes, indeed, I will put the link up. I will put that. It's type that little thing. See, I don't even have these things out on the cut and paste. Although I did also put the link in the video commentary too. So that's it. And whoops, DSGO. There we go. And absolutely correctly. That's my link. And everything is much appreciated that can help on that. I'm a one-man band at the moment, or with Jackson, a two-man band. And when I see what we can do together and how much we can pull information in and to do stuff in a way that I want to see a world in which any creationist that sticks up their head on YouTube will regret it. because you have people who can go after them with a source methods approach. The game they can't play. Remember, they can't play this game. If their brains could do it, they couldn't believe what they do. And all you need to do is to look and see how Kent Hovind is just fuming and trying to catch up to his apologetic when I've derailed his entire argument and keep ahead of him, and even talk baraminology, a creationist subject, more informed than he does. You won't persuade the diehards. You won't persuade the true believers. But anybody watching the show who is an open-minded person is going to be able to, maybe fence straddling. They've come from a religious background and they think there's maybe something to this, and they see the difference between the way I handle the matter and the way Kent handles the matter, and they decide, maybe I need to start looking this up more and start doing that research thing. And now you have another person doing the source methods. That's the goal that I have. It's got to be done one source at a time, one person at a time, one issue at a time. And thank you, Michelle, for bringing that thing up. Heat Shield says whack-a-mole. That's partly true, because dumb is a natural thing for humans to do. Source methods is... Yeah, jump in, Jackson.
I think we do that to some extent. I mean, there are a lot of channels like that do response videos, like Vice Rhinos. Yeah, the first one that came to mind. There are lots of other ones. I've done a few response videos.
In the past. He does nothing but that, and brilliantly so.
Yeah, lots of response videos to the Answers in Genesis team, and they're really great. They're fun to watch, and he invites lots of guests on to talk about him, including ourselves. We've been on his.
Yes. In fact, Paul just had me record a little blip. Apparently, he's going to do a plug for the TIP project on there, so he had me record a thing. And here, I feel happy that he was saying, could you get this maybe like by Sunday? And I had it that day. I'm not slow on the uptake once I figure out how to do a tool. And I was using all the tools that I had because I was recording the audiobook of Phileas Fogg. And by the way, let me put a plug up for that. Cheap plug. The Paralogs of Phileas Fogg. If you like fiction, if you like mysteries, if you like science fiction, if you like steampunk or any of those genres or historical fiction, you can get that one too, ebooks and Amazon.com. It's a mystery science fiction retelling of Around the World in 80 Days. It's a ripping good yarn. I'm quite proud of that too. And I'm writing the sequel of that. And that's another one. So perfect double feature. You could get your science book and your fiction book. And you can, and when 2018 scares the shit out of you, you can get out the book and jump back to 1872 and live a happy world, and that can take your mind off all the mess of that. I'm currently working on the sequel to Paralogs because I love the characters so much, and I can tell more stories with them. Phileas Fogg and Aouda and Passepartout are an interesting little trio of outsiders who are egalitarian and a bit of techno geeks and meddlers, and they have the resources to do it. I can vicariously have fine dining because I can have the Foggs dine at a fancy restaurant, and I can vicariously imagine all of that. So there's a psychological uplift to that. Although Jackson, since you're on the thing, you have bought me 2 pizzas already, and thank you very much. I got quite a lot of meals out of each one of those.
Everybody likes pizza.
Yeah, well, yes, they're perfect food. They have multiple phyla. You can do a science lecture on all of the phyla that are involved in a cheese pizza with mushroom and pepperoni and all that.
It's also stuff on it. Important to point out at the outset that pineapple is not a pizza topping.
Yes, I don't like pineapple personally. I have no prejudice against pineappleistas and will eat it if forced. But there's something about the acidic quality to it that I just go, nah. Other people in my family just love pineapples and that, but it's a foible. Puffalophilus, do I get more royalties from the ebook or paperback? No, it's about the same. I scheduled the structure. I decided what the prices were, and I did it in such a way that it was high enough that if a library theoretically bought the book, that they could manage to eke out things effectively for their techniques and that. And by the way, call attention to your local library. And see if they can get them. I'd love to see more of my books in the libraries. Puffalophilus, she also said, has no one noticed that Kent Hovind's approach to creationism is very similar to the way a homeless meth head would do it? In a way, Kent is, as I called him in the video, debate a bottom feeder, and he didn't like that at all. Kent likes to fancy himself as somebody who's in the upper echelon, cutting edge of creationism, and he's up there telling you what the skivvy is. No, he's not. He's a lower echelon repeater who has been a lower echelon repeater from the get-go. He doesn't even pay close attention to active creationism work. He just scavenges around for little blips and pieces like he did with Harwin Yahya, that was 15 years old at the time already. And that's the best he can do. And so if your game is to know his field, Bob Ludlow is an example of somebody who is approaching it from a source methods direction when he's debated with him, and Crocoduck and various others that have gone after him. If you know the Bill Hudlow, thank you. Shows you I don't bump into him all that much. At least I got his last name right this time. I keep on confusing him with Jim Hudlow, who lives in Spokane, who's part of our secular groups and that. And I keep on, and they both got beards in that too. So it just makes it more complicated in my brain for filing. But he did a good job because he had took note of the fact that Hovind is really repetitive. And so all you need to do is to look at old Hovind things, and you can see what he relies on and then find out what the sources are and be there ahead of him. Yeah. Yes, Heat Shield objecting. He loves the Hawaiian pizza with the pineapple. More power to you. Every Hawaiian pizza I get, if you're in the room, you get to eat it. That would be absolutely delightful. Well, there's another material that I put up on the links now that I've been blathering on about my book and other stuff. Which is about the supposed post-flood dispersal of humanity. This was one that I had tumbled onto a little while ago in conjunction with, I think it was a posting that was put up by Answers in Genesis or Creation Ministries, which I can't remember which, on Twitter. And so I followed up on it. And so I put the link to it at AIG. Yes, in fact, I think it was AIG. A fairly recent thing from Troy Lacey trying to argue that the dispersal from Babel is determinable scientifically. No, it didn't. And so he relies on a relatively small number of sources, and they are perfectly legitimate work on the Indo-European language family and others. But the problem is the world's bigger than that. There are Asians, and there are people in the Americas and Australia, and those people already were going great guns at the time that any theoretical Babylonian ziggurat would have been around. They have been off in their own hinterlands. The Australians arrived on there by certainly 40,000 years ago. I think some of the numbers suggest even far back to 60,000. The Amerindians are certainly in America by 15,000 years ago, and probably had some earlier elements coming in by boat paddling along the seashore of the, at that time, not yet submerged ocean, because the sea levels rose about 10,000 years ago, and has probably disturbed some of the material. And that's way before any Babel thing would be going on, maybe 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, whatever legends were being funneled in to the Babel story, and utterly impossible to account for all the haplotype distributions and all the other archaeological evidence, which of course Lacey doesn't bother to deal with. So I got several linkages up to some of the technical papers on that. The Beaker people, so-called because they had made distinctive beakers, duh. And a lot of those then, I wished I could have put up a direct link to the Nature paper that was discussed, but there's a full text on the commentary piece on it. And I make it a point never to put up linkages to things you can't get free online, because I want you to be able to see the whole text. So there's a bunch of stuff like that where I'm not able to follow up directly on like some of the mistakes that Rupi and Sanford make, because the technical papers aren't available open text online, and I'm not going to have you take my word for it. All the stuff that I put up, I want you to check out on your own, so you can look up the original material and see where it goes. Neprikos, it'd be nice if the historicity of the Bible included accounts from these mysterious people that lived 900 years. Yeah, that would be really fun. It'd be really nice to find out whether that would be physically possible to even do. But as we know, all the Bible tales are very restricted in their frame. It's essentially a little blip in the Middle East. And even then, it looks like lots of stuff have filtered in there from varying cultures. There are aspects of Egyptian mythology that end up in some of the things, the whole Tiamat cult, that figures eventually in Leviathan in the Bible. That the flood stories are partly drawn on the Babylonians and Sumerian accounts, but those further back go probably into some even earlier catastrophe involving the Black Sea flooding that filtered into the lore long before that got into the Babylonian things where they were talking about river flooding. And it's very still problematic as to whether the Hebrews were ever really in Egypt or not, or whether they picked up some of the Exodus tales and servitude issues secondhand from cultures they bumped into along the way before they eventually settled in Canaan. So it's still very, very murky. Puffalophagus asks, have you ever asked creationists why tomatoes weren't in Europe until after the Pilgrims came to America? Yeah, well, that would be a perfectly fine question to deal with. That would be part of that biogeography stuff, and it would involve plants and it would involve other areas. You find this biogeography issue, ironically, in lots of places. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. There are cornfields in Tolkien's corn and tobacco, all Native American plants that apparently Tolkien didn't realize had a provenance to them. He was a linguist, not an ethnobiologist. And so he had people making use of things that he knew from his culture. By the time he comes along, people were growing maize, as they would call it in everywhere but in the United States. We're the only ones that call it corn, because in corn, that's what they call wheat. And then the tobacco stuff, well, that's blatantly American, but spread around the world very, very quickly. So that same process that occurred with Lord of the Rings, incorporating elements that were anachronistic, but he didn't realize it. If you'd had somebody driving around a Model T Ford in Hobbiton, that would be just as anachronistic, but I guess he avoided that level of error. Nepricos, I'd like to see a kind of like a biome map of how the polytheism developed in each region, like Egyptian, Hebrew, Norse, etc. Oh, that's going to be a thicket. There have been charts I've seen of tracing the various connections between religious lores, and if you think gene trees look complicated, you should take a look at that one. It's a tangle, and that's because everybody borrows stuff from everybody else. All the cultures that we have, we can in many ways know a bit more about this in the Christian culture because there's been a lot of work on it. Some of the other cultures, Jackson brings up the Hebrews and the Zoroastrians. Yeah, the Zoroastrian religion, which still has some adherents knocking around, which had a concept of a god of light and a god of evil. And so you had Ahura Mazda and Ahriman going at each other tooth and nail. That concept began to filter around in the other cultures around them. And what was originally kind of a Persian concept was spread around because of conquests and Alexander the Great coming in and out and all that. So by the time you get down to the Dead Sea Scroll period, that notion of a god fighting an anti-god has troped in as God versus Lucifer and Satan. And so the Christian culture is not disconnected from all of the cultures that came previous. One of the reasons why Judeo-Christians home in on monogamy and have given up pretty much polygamy is because they adopted the Greco-Roman practice of having only one spouse. You could have a harem on the sly and have as many boinkings going on under the table, but you only have one official wife. And that was very much a Greco-Roman practice, and that got filtered in to become kind of standard operating procedure in the Catholic Church and all that from that point on. Well, if all religions do that, and trying to untangle what influences got plugged in at what point when you don't have the original sources to look at, well, duh. History is my gig, and so I'm well aware of this, and in fact advise a lot of people to avoid some of these doctrinal certitude things. I've mentioned it in other contexts, and I think I did a little video on it and did it in appointment with my lecture to some Seattle atheists a few years back, is that don't quibble whether Jesus existed or not. Don't draw a line in the sand to say he's fictional. There's a good circumstantial argument you can make that there was a physical Jesus at some point, but you got heavily mythologized from that point on. And so if you're trying to dig all of your trenches to defend that there's never a Jesus, there can't possibly be one, you run into the same snags with other figures. Can you prove there was a Homer or not who wrote the Iliad? No, that's even flimsier than Jesus. It's all completely circumstantial. You only have the physical works to go on. And likewise with even Alexander the Great. Literally, all the accounts of Alexander the Great's deeds were written several centuries after the fact. And that makes it a little tougher to try to make sense out of what was going on. We get into the same problem. I'm very much into Roman history, and you get into exactly the same problem with the Julio-Claudians. I mean, how much of the tittle-tattle about Caligula and Nero are true? Socrates, yes, Jackson just brought up Socrates. All we know really about Socrates is what he is in the Platonic dialogues. And there's a suspicion among scholars of Platonism that a lot of the later Socrates is Plato's sock puppeting, that he's saying Socrates says when in fact it's Plato's opinion, not Socrates. And so trying to figure out how much is Socrates and how much is Plato post hoc is hard to do because you don't have any original texts. So this is a thing that's not unique to Jesus issues. And if you try to draw firm lines in the sand, you're going to find that somebody who knows more of the history than you do can potshot you on these other examples to say, well, boy, are you going to argue that Caesar's mythical now? And so you need to be able to be very, very careful in weighing into this kind of stuff. Puffalophagus, that's correct, kind of helps. Alexander has his face on the currency, and he's got cities named after him, and there are monuments that are put up, and there's all sorts of stuff that you can go on. And so now you can build up a secondary structure of things. And it's by that secondary inference that we build up a very detailed accounting of what went on in Alexandrian times. And you find out what happened in later periods, and you have letters that go back and forth, and people refer to stuff when they're talking about this and that and thus and such. So you build up a nexus of things that help corroborate or at least render more plausible some of the tales that are only known from the secondary sources that you don't have the provenance on. So this history gig is harder than science because scientists don't have to worry about rocks lying to them, but people can lie and people can dissemble and people can have faulty memories and put up bullshit even as monuments. I mean, you can't take any of the official propaganda on Egyptian monuments at face value. It's propaganda. And so you got to realize that it's much more complex than that. Yes, Brian Stevens says we need to make Jeebus coins and sell them at a huge profit to the believers. I think that's already been done functionally. They just call them books and things. Michelle Desert, is curious about the Rh negative factor, and because there isn't any good info out there. That's one I can't say that I'm super duper knowledgeable on. I know it's, if memory serves me, it's a specialized feature of our human blood system. And as far as I can recall, and if you know anything about this, Jackson, jump right in. As far as I know, it's not been worked out at the molecular level exactly how it originated. So there's just kind of speculative as they're trying to work back through the primates and try to figure out what varieties and stuff are going on. And I know some creationists have brought it up. I don't know that intelligent designers have dwelled on it nearly as much, but creationists will bring it up. So at the moment, I wish I could say, gee whiz, I got a nice, easy answer for you, but the factor, let me see if I've got anything I don't have my main bibliography open, so I can't go flitting around on that. Sorry. But if memory serves me on it, it's still an open question as to exactly how it originated. So it's presumably a human-specific trait, which means sometime since we separated from the chimpanzees. And the dynamics of it, it'll take probably another few years of paleogenomics to resolve. So put that on your question mark follow-up list, Michelle. I take it that because you have not jumped in, Jackson, you don't know any more about this than I do. So
this also my internet's been kind of dropping out.
Yeah, it's there are always going to be cutting edge issues of things because there are examples. Orphan genes, ORF, orphan genes are ones that are ones that they don't yet know a homology for. So in other words, there's not an obvious example of one in another organism to say, oh, well, this got from a gene duplication somewhere back, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't mean it's magic that it got there by deliberate design. It's mean that we don't have the tracers available to deal with. And particularly if some things go back a long ways or in unusual contexts, you don't have the paleogenomic field to play with yet. This, of course, is on steroids when you deal with origin of life, because we have little teeny fossolates of stuff knocking around in the big LUCA organism system, which is the one that we can retro-engineer to kind of figure out what LUCA might have had, what genes. That's the last universal common ancestor. If you don't know the acronym of LUCA, get used to it. You're going to hear it from now on, all of that. So we've got all these wonderful little areas where there's always going to be cutting edge issues that we haven't worked out yet. And you probably want to pay attention to it because as in that Rh negative factor, you've got the creationists will home in on this. See, the evolution scientists cannot figure out how this happened yet. And some things are very, very hard to work out. Some things may be intractable, where you can't perform an experiment conveniently on it to be able to deal with it. Some origin of life questions may be that way. But don't ever count the science out on these things. That we know a great deal more about how so many genes work out. And in other areas, then you eventually have to work out the original origin of the gene. So like the HOX gene system, one of the ones that I keep on putting in as one of my little question mark things is proto-HOX. That there's just starting work on trying to figure out what was the gene system that led to the HOX system that we see ubiquitously in metazoans. And because they only figured out that there were any HOX genes starting in the 1990s, that this is still ongoing work. So peg your RH factor and a few other things like that in the pending science work department and be aware of the pending science. That's another reason why creationists who like to home in on those things do so for a darn good reason, because it's a question mark. And you can't honestly say, well, we know the answer to that, because we don't know the answer to that. Which is why if you know the things we do know the answer to that they ignore, that's a different kettle of fish. They say, I don't need to lose sleep at night trying to figure out how Rh negative developed. I know the reptile mammal transition data. So I see a big picture origin of things where I can see lots of benchmarks, and I know that anti-evolutionists don't pay attention to the reptile mammal transition. So explain the reptile mammal transition to me first, then we'll worry about Rh negative. So you can move the field from something that's got question marks to an area that doesn't have the question marks. That's why I picked the reptile mammal transition, because it's a macroevolution case that's got way solider blips than you find even in bird origins and whales. And there are a lot of ones where you do eventually find some spots where you got some kind of big question marks. At best, you got some little itty bitty question marks in the reptile mammal transition, plus some spectacular predicted fossils. So it's not as sexy. The vast majority of reptile mammal characters look like little mouse-like things. And creationists, as Jackson knows firsthand, are prone to think, oh, well, they're just mice. They're just a form of beaver.
If it looks like a mouse, it must be a mouse. That's that cognitum for you.
Yeah. And but they're way more than that. And so the RMT, that's another one. I will know I will be successful when people will refer to the RMT, meaning the reptile mammal transition, and people will know what that means. I tend to type it all out, even though it's got too many characters, and I can't use the little RMT acronym because they'll have to say, well, what the hell are you talking about? Michelle Desert, it's true. The creationists claim it's the bloodline of Jesus. Well, you get that lore, that pops up in the stuff that leads off to the Da Vinci Chronicle stuff. You've got this notion that there was a physical bloodline of Jesus. And remember, the whole point of the Hebrew Messiah was that they were of the Davidic ancestry. It was a bloodline issue, that one of the house of David, anointed of God, was going to come on and get rid of the Romans. So you had to maintain it within that kind of a framework. And the medieval culture that, of course, was knee-deep in royal lineages, and they were tracing all of this stuff, and particularly at a time, it may be not a coincidence that some of this bloodline obsession comes in at the time that there's a diminution of aristocracy. People forget today, of course, we have like royal houses in England that are tourist traps because they're run by the government, and the former Duke of something or other has a little apartment somewhere, but basically it's in the National Trust, and people come in and they do antiques road shows in the front yard and all that kind of stuff. Well, this sort of process had been going on for a long time, to where there had been in the late Middle Ages, in right around that period, 12, 1300, and so on, an awful lot of those knights that had latifundia estates were losing them in the economic tumult of the period. And nouveau riche who were doing things like making stuff and doing textiles and doing silver mines and stuff, and these tended not to be princes, were encroaching on them. And they were often buying up old estates from other people because they couldn't afford them anymore. And so there was an attrition of a lot of that aristocracy. And plus, keeping up the old style knights and things was very expensive. And then that damn gunpowder came along. And now they had to figure out how to deal with armor-piercing bullets that were making it more and more difficult to have conventional knights. And so there was an attrition all through that period. And then there was another one even more aggressively in the Renaissance and the modern period, as you had now a rise of a capitalist class, where you had business people making big trading things and East India Company and all these stuff, where suddenly people with no pedigree at all were making tons of money and buying way bigger estates than you can, and they can afford it. And so this obsession with bloodline stuff, when you get nervous about your position because you're useless, and the only thing you have is I'm Sir somebody or other, or Lord what's it, that you have some pedigree by birth, not by accomplishment, then you pay attention to these little things, to where you go, oh yes, I'm a Romanov, I'm a Bourbon, I'm the line of Jesus, I'm such and so. And now you can pretend as though you are important when you haven't done a damn thing. You only have a lineage. So that kind of philosophy of life is sad and pathetic. But you found with nouveau riche in the United States, the number of rich families that started marrying their kids off in loveless marriages that most of them didn't turn out well, to impoverished aristocrats. So a couple of the Gould kids got married off to impoverished princes, and I think some of the Vanderbilt kids got pawned off that way. And it was depressing to see the need to do that. I don't think J.P. Morgan ever bothered doing it. He just bought some old landed estate and lived like a prince. He didn't care one way or the other whether he had a title or not. He didn't try to buy one. But the Astors, yeah, they pumped into it too. In fact, Lady Astor was one of the Astor clan kids that had married into royalty. And so they had a title floating around, and she was a lady, and she was in the House of Lords. And Churchill had a bunch of jousts with her because he couldn't stand her and she couldn't stand him. And of course, Churchill, remember, was a mongrel in the other direction because his mother was an American and non-titled. So he was one of these upstart mixed breeds, one of the muggles that's leaking into the thing. So you can see that the kind of ethnocentricity that you see in Voldemort in the Harry Potter books, that's intentional. That's an analog of the kind of processes that this blood lineage notion shows up. And you even get it in almost comic relief level of to where does Elizabeth Warren have Indian blood in her or not, and who the hell should care? It's a peculiar circumstance where people worry about that. I have some sense about some of the ancestry I have, but I don't care. I'm concerned about the people that I live with now and my family now, and the fact that we may have some German, Danish, Dutch, and who knows what else knocking around in there. I'm assuming some Neanderthal. I haven't had a DNA test done, but I have light skin. I'm from European background, so the odds are I probably got some Neanderthal in me. Yay! Mongrel, mongrel, happy mongrel. And there we go. So we're just past the hour. We've gone on a bit long. I tried to answer all the questions that went on in there. We'll do a quick summary that contested bones is still stupid. They are under-researched and evasive and manipulative, and following up on the sources in a source methods approach is highly desirable. There was no grandiose post-flood migration of people or a spread of languages after Babel, because those are both fictional events. So you're never going to find solid evidence for it. And then help out, get Slam Dunk, get Phileas Fogg if you like reading fiction. Help the old RJ keep on going so that I don't turn into a corpsicle in the cold house. I got the temperature set at 52. And we look like we're going to have a kind of mild winter this year, according to the forecasts. And so fingers crossed, it may be a while before the furnace turns on. And then I have to worry what I have to do with a 3/8 of a tank. So anyway, thank you all for the day. Thank you for Jackson showing up. We're both busy working on the new book, which if you think evolution slam dunk vaporize the creationists on the reptile mammal transition, wait till you see what we're doing with Answers in Genesis. Holy moly, there's going to be blood on the sand. Okay, well, thank you very much, and stay tuned and coming. Next week is Halloween, so I'm going to be worried about whether or not they're going to be trick-or-treaters banging on the door during the middle of the show, but we'll find out what happens.